Is the US becoming more fascist? Well, the short answer is sort of, but let me explain. In 2003, a political scientist by the name of Dr. Lawrence Britt wrote an article about his 14 observations of fascism. He found that the same 14 characteristics were crucial in the fascist regimes of Germany, Italy, Spain, Indonesia, and Chile. So let's use this as a starting point to see how many fascist qualities the US exhibits. Characteristic number 1, powerful and continuing nationalism. Fascist regimes tend to make constant use of patriotic mottos, slogans, symbols, songs, and other paraphernalia. Flags are seen everywhere, as are flag symbols on clothing and in public displays. Oh God, where to begin? Starting with the beginning of the Cold War and Red Scares, we see a growing sense of nationalist fervor in the US. The belief that we're the world superpower, that we alone stand against the evil empire of the USSR, and that capitalism is as American as apple pie and Sunday school have all fed the idea of American exceptionalism and superiority. I mean, just try laying an American flag on the ground and watch how quickly you get assaulted. Characteristic number 2, disdain for the recognition of human rights. Because of fear of enemies and need of security, the people in fascist regimes are persuaded that human rights can be ignored in certain cases because of need. The people tend to look the other way or even approve of torture, summary executions, assassinations, long incarcerations of prisoners, etc. Again, it's difficult to find a place to start. Mandatory minimum sentences, anti-Muslim sentiments, not caring about our country, breaking human rights, and the Geneva Convention. The list goes on. Perhaps it is best personified in Guantanamo Bay, where several prisoners have been found to be innocent, where torture is not only used but approved by the American people. Characteristic number 3, identification of enemies, scapegoats as a unifying cause. The people are rallied into a unifying patriotic frenzy over the need to eliminate a perceived common threat or foe. Racial, ethnic, or religious minorities, liberals, communists, socialists, terrorists, etc. One only has to look at the Red Scares, Islamophobia, or xenophobic policies of the right wing to see this come to life in the US. Fascists think it's okay to marginalize and demonize a group because of their hyper-emotional bigotry. The best example of this is the establishment of a war on terror. It makes no sense to establish a war on a state of being rather than a country. This creates a perpetual war. You can't win a war against terror. Number 4, supremacy of the military. Even when there are widespread domestic problems, the military is given a disproportionate amount of government funding, and the domestic agenda is neglected. Soldiers and military services are glamorized. The U.S. spent $618 billion on the military in 2014. That's the most on the planet, with China coming in at $171 billion. For a frame of reference, the U.S. had a population of 318.9 million people in 2014. China had a population of 1.35 billion. The U.S. is spending 18% of its budget on defense. There seems to be a disproportionate amount of spending here. Characteristic number 5, rampant sexism. The government of fascist nations tend to be almost exclusively male-dominated. Under fascist regimes, traditional gender roles are made more rigid. Divorce, abortion, and homosexuality are suppressed, and the state is represented as the ultimate guardian of the family institution. The U.S. has become less sexist over the past few decades. This, of course, is all to the dismay of the right wing. We still have a massive part of the country who wants to enforce traditional gender roles, support abortion, and homosexuality. This is the first point that could differ significantly from fascism. Point number 6, controlled mass media. Sometimes the media is directly controlled by the government, but in other cases the media is indirectly controlled by government regulations or sympathetic media spokespeople and executives. Censorship, especially in wartime, is very common. This is an extremely nuanced point. The government in the US doesn't directly control the media. Instead, we have a few large corporations that mostly act to keep people apathetic and misinformed. Look at how media coverage is framed in today's news. There is a focus on framing rather than truth. Why would a station owned by Comcast criticize another company owned by Comcast? There is a massive conflict of interest when so much is owned by so few companies. Why is this a problem? Corporations own the government, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Characteristic number 7, obsession with national security. Fear is used as a motivational tool by the government over the masses. This goes into war on terror again. It's highly convenient to have a constant war where it's impossible to win. This creates a constant state of fear, especially when we see how the US helped use the Taliban, Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, etc. In every election cycle, we see demagogues on the right spreading bigotry to scare the populace. They use this atmosphere to constantly spout their national defense plans. Just ask a Republican what the most important issue our country faces right now is. Characteristic number 8, religion and government are intertwined. Governments in fascist nations tend to use the most common religion in the nation as a tool to manipulate public opinion. Religious rhetoric and terminology is common from government leaders, even when the major tenets of the religion are diametrically opposed to the government's policies or actions. The constant right-wing attempt to claim the U.S. as a Christian nation is no secret. In the past, the idea of the separation of church and state was something we took seriously. But again, if we go back to the Red Scares, we see where this started. Now we have under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, on our currency, and the Ten Commandments on public grounds. There are even several states where atheists can't legally hold office. Religion is absolutely becoming more intertwined with the government in the U.S. Characteristic number 9, corporate power is protected. The industrial and business aristocracy of fascist nations often are the ones who put the government leaders into power, creating a mutually beneficial business-government relationship and power elite. To me, this is the single biggest point we can make. Lobbying, legalized bribery, the regulations favoring big business are all symptoms of the same beast, corporatism. The U.S. is arguably the single biggest corporatist state on the planet now. I'm going to dive deeper into the next post about inverted totalitarianism. Characteristic number 10, labor power is suppressed. Because the organizing power of labor is the only real threat to a fascist government, labor unions are either eliminated entirely or are severely suppressed. Labor unions started to be truly targeted with the Red Scares and fear of communist infiltrators. It was simple to the McCarthyist. Unions were communist and not American. This has had a devastating effect in the U.S. With the destruction of unions by the right, we have experienced wages flatline and poor working conditions. This is all very favorable for the corporatists in control of the government. In the past, unions would fund the Democrats and corporations would fund the Republicans. Even though this was reprehensible, it at least provided a balance of power. With the destruction of unions, Democrats had to turn to corporations too. Surprise, surprise, the neoliberals turned to banks. Point number 11, disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Fascist nations tend to promote and tolerate open hostility to higher education and academia. It is not uncommon for professors and other academics to be censored or even arrested. Free expression in the arts and letters is openly attacked. This is the second point where the U.S. isn't quite so fascist, at least not in the classical sense. In the U.S., we simply rely on the apathetic populace to ignore intellectuals. But we can still see several examples of open hostility to evolution, climate change, and even studying gun control, all by one wing of the country. This disdain for certain academic fields is unique to the U.S. among first world nations. Characteristic number 12, obsession with crime and punishment. Under fascist regimes, the police are given almost limitless power to enforce laws. The people are often willing to overlook police abuse and even forego civil liberties in the name of patriotism. There is often a national police force with virtually unlimited power in fascist nations. We truly do live in a police state. The for-profit prison system has bolstered that. Mandatory minimum sentences for victimless crimes like drug use plague the poorest among our citizens. Cops use obvious and excessive force. A massive part of our country are guilty until proven innocent, simply because of the color of their skin. All this happens as people applaud the cops' use of violence or find ways to excuse their actions. This also bleeds into the NSA and other ways that the populace is being policed. If you try to stop it, you're labeled a terrorist who compromises national security. Think Edward Snowden. Characteristic number 13, rampant cronyism and corruption. Fascist regimes almost always are governed by groups of friends and associates who appoint each other to government positions and use government power and authority to protect their friends from accountability. It is not uncommon in fascist regimes for national resources and even treasures to be appropriated or even outright stolen by government leaders. Do we see this in a country fueled by lobbying? Bribery has been legalized in the U.S., and our Supreme Court used the First Amendment to do it. I'll cover this in more detail in the next post about inverted totalitarianism and corporatism. Characteristic number 14, fraudulent elections. Sometimes elections in fascist nations are a complete sham. Other times elections are manipulated by smear campaigns against or even assassination of opposition candidates, use of legislation to control voting numbers or political district boundaries, and manipulation of the media. Fascist nations also typically use their judiciaries to manipulate or control elections. This isn't outright happening on a grand scale in the U.S. Instead, we tout the U.S. as a shining symbol of democracy. all the while undermining democracy with the campaign finance system. The US is often referred to as an oligarchy because you must have a certain amount of money in order to do anything. If you don't gain support of corporations and the rich, you won't get elected. This way, politicians don't represent us, the people. They represent the rich. It's common for entire families to be deeply involved in politics. The Bushes, the Kennedys, the Clintons all come to mind. So we see that every single point on the list can describe the US in some fashion. Some points are more obvious than others, but something still seems missing. Why doesn't the US have an emphatic dictator or massive Nazi youth rallies? Why doesn't it celebrate the destruction of democracy and encourage government control of all production? Because there are some subtle but dangerous differences. In the next post, I will cover corporatism and inverted totalitarianism.